Good morning again. Bonjour. Buenos días. Tengo muchos. Well, I don't think we have interpretation, but for French, so I'm not going to indulge in Spanish, although it is true that there was a big push on this topic from Latin America especially, and we're particularly proud of that. And that's why you see with me today really a number of experts that have been really deeply engaged in the realm. Now, we now use this as an acronym, but that means readiness assessment methodology. That is actually what countries asked UNESCO to do. Not only, so in the recommendation itself, and I think that's another impressive characteristics of that normative instrument, not only you had the principles, you agreed, 193 member states agreed on the principle, the values, the policy areas, gender being one of them, and be unique to this instrument. But actually, countries were so, forward-looking to tell us, not only tell us what to do, but help us understand how to. And this is why, in the recommendation, countries asked us to develop two tools. One of them being the readiness assessment methodology, that is basically telling us, please, help us get a picture of where we are. Tell us what we have. Tell us what we don't have. Tell us what we can actually use of the infrastructure, the legislation we have, the setting, the endowment, in order to be able to develop, deploy, and use AI ethically. And ethically here means really that upholds human rights, human dignities, and fundamental freedoms, so really key to the core of our societies. And they also asked us to do the ethical impact assessment, that is basically yet another hands-on tool that is about understanding whether what is coming out of the innovation funnel or what has already been out, whether it complies with this requirement. And this actually benefits all of us. I mean, think about, let me do a parallel, because sometimes when we talk about ramps, and I mean, for us at UNESCO, it's really so nice to hear, for instance, so many ministers to say, my RAM. I mean, ADG Ramos always says like, it feels like very, strong, like my RAM. And this is like, you own it. And imagine, so let me do a parallel. You feel pain somehow, and you need to go to the doctor, and the doctor says, well, you have some bone broken. There are two ways. You might take an X-ray to understand where the problem is. First of all, whether there is a problem and where the problem is, or you can get into the surgery room, and then we see. Would you go into the surgery room that way? I don't think so. Well, that's exactly what the RAM does. That is, before saying there is a problem, Houston, we have a problem, let's check whether the problem is there and what is the definition of the problem, if there is a problem, or whether there are systemic parts of it that can actually help you address your needs and constraints. And so here, the pleasure is to have 4 experts, high-level experts, because here everybody's very humble, but all these experts really have a solid curriculum in the back and solid contributions, which I really invite you to have a look at online. So I have the pleasure to have Carolina Aguirre, Elena Estavillo Flores, Saida Belouali, and Julio Alberto Bertuse. And my first question is, since this is really about what this snapshot about where we are with AI actually tells us about the gender inclusion. And let me also do a very small excursion here, and is that, do we realize that if women are not involved, we are basically discriminating, more or less, half of the world population? That's as simple as that. So it is actually algorithms, devices, decision support mechanisms that by the time do not see women involved in their development, do not see women-related data. And then, there is intersectionality issue at stake as well, so races, origin, socio-cultural background is not taken into account. By brute force, if data are biased and don't take this into account, the results of the prediction are going to be not really useful and not very accurate. So that's why it is important for us to have this perspective inside the realms. So I would perhaps start with Carolina, and really based on your experience, because you've been involved in the realm of Uruguay, what is this exercise, what has this exercise been able to tell us about how and to what extent women are included and what could be done for it?
Okay, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, UNESCO, Gabriela Ramos, Eleonora Lam for inviting me. So I ran the RAM last year in Uruguay, and this process was undertaken in the context of a revision of the current national AI strategy, which has a governmental focus. And the RAM is instrumental in bringing in a broader perspective on AI governance in the country, less centered on how government uses AI, which is the current focus of the existing AI strategy that was approved, put in practice in 2021. And so the RAM, and for those of you who don't know it, and I'm taking the opportunity as being the first one in the panel, I mean, it encompasses over nearly 200 indicators, and in one of its core dimensions, the social cultural dimension, it addresses the gender dimension. And this is, I mean, this special focus brings in the kind of granularity that we need in order to bring in further perspectives on how to address AI governance and women's participation in the governance of AI. Because actually, what in the case of Uruguay, it really rendered visible is that we don't have enough statistics, we don't have enough approaches on how to measure this and approach this. So, for example, when we see, specifically in women's participation in AI governance through the RAM, the importance of addressing the gender gap in the country is recognized. It highlights in Uruguay the need to integrate a gender perspective into these kind of assessments, which currently there is none. So what the RAM renders visible is that there are very few specific indicators of diversity, inclusion and equality addressing women. And though, for example, the country boasts, I mean, that 91% of women used the internet in the last 3 months versus 89% of men, and that 84% of women used it in the last month versus 81% of men. So we are seeing, we are seeing that women generally use these technologies, but we get, for example, different kind of statistics when we address the graduate women in STEM careers in the country. It's 45 versus 55%. So women are, there's a 10% percentual gap there. And though Uruguay is in position number 67 in the Global Gender Gap Index, the Educational Performance Subindex is where it retains the highest score. It ranks a bit better off in the economic participation, but in political participation in terms of women in positions of political power, and the state is really lacking. So all in all, I mean, and just to continue with the conversation, I think that the key exercise, and I had really the honor and opportunity to sort of work closely with the Uruguayan government in terms of the reframing of the strategy, was how few indicators the country has produced and has in the thought process about developing a strategy around AI and ICTs concerning women's participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Elena, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I want to start just by saying that Mexico's RAM was a special process because at the moment there was no official governmental interest or focus on AI. No, and that was really the situation. So we got to have support for these consultations that we had to put on from the Senate, no, and that helped a lot. And it is interesting because the same process of working for the RAM and for organizing these consultations brought informal groups or groups that, for example, were active in academia and were studying these issues. This process brought them together. And so public interest on the subject came about just for working on the RAM, and it was a very interesting process to look at that in Mexico. What we have found is maybe it's the same results as other countries. No, in general, about specific data, well, that almost the same number of women and men use the internet, but this is a very general and high-level approach, because if you look at, for example, women using the internet at work, there's a huge gap. No? More men use internet for working than women. In single-parent households, there's less spending on mobile broadband when you have a household headed by women. Why? Because women are poorer. No, this is clear. And if they are in charge of a household, it makes it harder. And also a huge gap between urban and rural population. And very scarce, as everywhere, very scarce data on gender data. No, as gender is not systematically measured, and we have some disaggregated data, but this is not enough. And most of the data that we could find are from different sources, so it's very hard to make comparisons. There are different ways of measuring, and some come from STEM measures also, and this is, STEM is not measured in the same way in everywhere, so each country or each organization has its own definition of STEM, so even when we find data for STEM, we're not measuring the same things. In Mexico, this data that we got for STEM, it, for example, says that only 32% graduates in these subjects are women, so this is a very, very large gap, but it depends on how STEM is defined. We look also to other things that are, well, it's, for example, in early ages, how girls with high performance in science or mathematics, from them, only 27% expect to be professionals in science and engineering, compared with 43% among boys. No, and even when girls that are performing very high in these subjects. And also in Mexico, it's interesting because we have very strong constitutional protections for gender, for equality. We have equal rights between women and men, the right for the entire population to be a part of the information and knowledge society through a universal digital inclusion policy. We also have the right of indigenous communities to incorporate technologies to increase their own productivity. It's also protected in the Constitution. And the principle of gender parity, that it's not so common, that we also have in the Constitution for the executive and legislative branches. And that is why from some years we have had parity in Congress in Mexico. But we don't have equivalent obligations for the private sector, for companies. And also, we have no evaluations of how these principles and obligations are working, no, in reality. So we made some proposals in the RAM report, and to train all people involved in the different stages of the AI cycle on bias, gender perspective, and human rights, and to define public policies to reduce digital violence against women and other other vulnerable groups and prevent the hypersexualization of women and girls through AI, and to eradicate the feminization of poverty and precariousness in the labor context of AI. These were specific, but yes, what we look at that many statistics are missing in general. We do not collect, we do not make public. If there exists the data, it is not made public. So if people don't know the data, then we cannot use it for better decision making. And data is more scarce for gender and other marginalized groups. And also this, that even when we have a good legal framework to enshrine rights, it does not translate into reality if there's a lack of mechanisms, if we don't have resources to ensure that these principles are fulfilled. And without resources and concrete actions, principles and laws don't become reality. We need to move from discourse, resource, to action. Thank you.
I think you're starting getting a sense of the strength of the evidence that is emerging. And let me underline, I mean, nobody's perfect. I'm a microeconometrician. I'm very sensitive to the power of data. And the data actually that they have been citing, if anything, are on the positive margin. They've been citing data about entry into STEM. Now, for those that have had the dubious pleasure to delve deeper into the statistics, what you see is that there is a phenomenon called the leaky STEM pipeline. That is, the statistics we have heard are at the entry. Now, because of peer pressure, because of family constraint, because of lack of acceptance into the, let's say, the job itself in a world that is really techno-intense and therefore very masculine in certain settings, what we see is that those that really make it into the jobs, in this case related to AI, are a subset of those that enter the STEM. So if we think that, for instance, and I mean, I was amazed to see the 45% that was mentioned by Carolina. Well, that is the entry point. How many of them did reach the market? How many of them were able to also break the glass ceiling and get to the top positions? And actually, we do have analysis here at UNESCO, which was published last year, that actually shows how even simply the language in job posting can put off women from certain positions because it is hostile, whereas evidence shows that gender-neutral language or even female friendly language doesn't bother anybody. And so men enter and participate in the same way. And actually, we also saw that the career progression is actually facilitated by the time the language is more inclusive. And frankly, language-related prescriptions are not costly. So a type of policy that is easy to implement, is sufficient to have something in a law, and then just avoid using some words is as simple as that. And that can make a huge difference in the participation rate of people in the labor market, especially in AI. And let's not also get mistaken about one feature. And I'm so happy to see so many men in the room. This needs to be a conversation with the whole of society, because the inclusion of women benefits everybody. So here, I mean, taking the French word râleur, here we are not just complaining for the sake of complaining. Here, what we try to underline is actually that everybody benefits by the time women are more included. And I mean, last year, ADG Ramos launched the first gender-based resilience report, where we do highlight very clearly what are the links between the empowerment of women and what that means for productivity, innovativeness, inclusion, societal cohesion. And actually this year, watch out for that. In the context of the forthcoming Forum Against Racism and Discrimination, happening in Barcelona in December, there will be the launch of the second gender-based resilience, where actually one of the focus is on gender and AI, together with, of course, democratic processes and the inclusion of women in that and the position of women in power. But let's continue to learn what have been the insights of the RAMs, now changing completely the area of the world where this exercise was performed. Over to you, Saida, please.
Merci. Thank you, Maria Grazia. I'm going to speak in French, if I may. Thank you very much. So first and foremost, I must start off by thanking Gabriela Ramos and all of the UNESCO staff for not having only welcomed me here today, but more particularly because I know this tool, this RAM tool, and I have followed the recommendation since it was a white paper. And this is a document that I discovered with one of my PhD students, and I followed all of the reflection upon this subject. And personally speaking, I'm fascinated by this recommendation and the tool which will allow for the implementation of these principles, because it's true, I often hear people, okay, let's do things, let's move on to action. But I think the best adapted tool for these principles that are within the recommendation on intelligence, artificial intelligence, I think is a very good example of why this is the case. Because when we've deployed it with our teams in Morocco, I was fascinated by the results. Why do I say that? Because I discovered things that I had never suspected existed if I hadn't used this very tool. I discovered that there was what we could say a soft source in terms of what's happening in the gender divide, not just because, for example, Morocco made the decision to institutionalize this gender approach and has ratified myriad conventions and protocols over the world. But I also discovered that women and girls were in fact themselves very involved in the world of technology and over and beyond figures. May I perhaps just show you why this tool is so important? Let me give you a few figures about Morocco. But before going into figures, maybe I should tell you that today I am teaching in an engineering school as we speak, and in one of the classes where I teach, which is IT engineering, 90% of my students are girls. That's huge. And I don't think that is something that one would find in statistics, but it's a reality. So today in Morocco, and this is the tool that allowed us to have this mapping of the reality in Morocco, because what's interesting here is in terms of the recommendation and all of the debates that we had, we saw that all artificial intelligence tools, if they're not regulated, if they're not able to be framed, and if we don't supervise them, then they will in fact undermine many of things that we want to do, and will also reflect prejudice. And when one looks at countries like my own, it's important to talk about the divides that exist, and it's thanks to a tool like this that we can see. So thanks to RAM, we were able to see that we have one of the highest levels of female engineers in the world, 42% of women, 26% in France, 14% in Japan. So, and I'm convinced of this because this is a study that has been around since 2018, but I'm sure that if we were to update the figures, it would be even higher today. So we have have a parity which is in favor of women in terms of STEM. So it's 20% for women and 17% for men. So that's why I'm talking about this soft power. But of course, this is supported by public policy, but I also think it reflects something that's culture. It would be difficult for me to explain it, find the words for it, but these are changes that are nonetheless extremely important. And despite the gender digital gap that continues, and in terms of gender parity and the digital divide that still exists, we nonetheless have parity in terms of the use of the internet. We also have the inclusive index use, which shows that we are the 22nd position, and it's thanks to the electronic inclusion of women that this is the case. And it's also thanks to the open data policy that we have put in place. And indeed, if one talks about electronic inclusion of women, why is this? It's because there's huge efforts that have been done to this end, or made to this end. Now, it's true that when one talks about gender, it is undoubtedly a complex debate. When we want to come to pure and entire parity, here we can talk about a cultural revolution. It's not merely something that will come from technology. We can use this technology to maybe transform the mentalities, people's approaches. In fact, what I would like to say, you've got intelligence and artificial intelligence, which is, of course, shaking the very foundations of society, of our economies, but one maybe can use this to maybe be the reason to maybe shake the way we think, to change our mindsets, and maybe allow this moment to change the way we conceive of our world and look at male and female relationships and how we can then take on board this gender dimension. So I think that artificial intelligence and its existence means that we should go perhaps beyond the discussions that we're having today. When we're supervising data, when we clean this data, so to speak, I think we need to go further and think of the cultural and societal dimensions that are linked to it. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Saida. As a matter of fact, algorithmic bias, as you well underlined, is just one of the components. And let me also perhaps remind us all why we might want to get rid of it, among other things. And it's about the productivity effect, the quality of the AI and the kind of AI we might get. I mean, everybody here, now you had our great interpreters kick in order to go from French to English and vice versa. Now everybody here that speaks another language in addition to his own native language knows the beauty and the pain of learning and getting to a level of communicating well, right? At the beginning you start translating from your language, then you start thinking the other way, right? You start articulating the sentences in a way that actually mimic the way of thinking. Hence the reference that Saida was making to transforming the mentality. Now, taking that parallel into AI, the AI coding itself will be enriched the more diverse the perspective that contribute to it. Because I, for instance, might have a predilection to implement something that is very efficient. Other people might have a particular eye on the ability to have non-biased data. Other experts might have a particular bias towards optimizing the behavior of the system, being careful that it is environmentally sustainable. That is, the loop I'm designing is not only very efficient, but tries to consume as few resources, this being the computing power, the energy, you name it, as possible, because my concern, my point of view differs. So that is why having women, having people of different origins, of different races, of different groups, of different beliefs, it's very important. Because actually there was an article just showed up yesterday that showed how, for instance, AI systems and AI algorithms even mimic and reproduce the possible political biases that one might have. Because our brain translates into this code. So the more diverse, the more inclusive the result will be. And let me get now to Julio Alberto, the last but not least, especially since actually Chile was the very first country to finalize a RAM. And since then, we have leveraged this exercise to a massive extent. Over to you.
Thank you very much. So the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let me start with the good about the information that we recovered from the RAM. There's virtually no gender gaps in terms of access to technology. in terms of broadband penetration, internet usage in the country. That's what the data revealed when we were doing the exercise. In addition, and speaking about the leaky pipeline that you were mentioning, Maria Gracia, earlier before, there are no differences in terms of PISA score attainment in math between boys and girls. Now, where you start seeing the difference is in the performance and the number of women versus male graduates that go into the STEM field and that would like to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So the proportion of males, it's 38.1%. The proportion of women, it's 22.7%. When doing the RAM, and this is another probably commonality between all the previous speakers, you can't manage what you don't measure. And it's very difficult to have really accurate data in terms of gender gaps. So universities are not required to run or disclose information on whether the publications the publications that are being created out of universities have a gender perspective, or the number of male or female professors that might be in a given institution. Now, fortunately, you need to think that AI, it's not only technology as a challenge, but it's also a tool. So it's fairly easy, for example, to do a very simple exercise when you can crawl and you can crawl all the papers that have been published on AI on a country, just using simple keywords, AI, machine learning, reinforced learning, and you get all the scholars that have published a paper that has that on the topic. And then you can run GPT with a library that can select whether they're male or female. So I did that exercise prior to this conference, and I know that in Chile, 3,704 people have published at least one paper related to AI. And when you start doing the numbers on trying to figure out whether they're male or female, well, it turns out that GPT is able to classify 95% of the names. 5% are not classifiable. And out of that 95, 77% are men, and let me correct, and 18% of the names were classified as female, which I thought was something, a huge gap, but then I heard Gabriela at the beginning of the conference mentioning that only 12% of women have published in AI worldwide, so I think that's kind of the good. Now, another exercise that you can do, and it's very interesting, is that generally we think about AI development and the gender gaps in developing the technology. But this is a general purpose technology, and as a general purpose technology, it's penetrating into different scientific fields. So you can also run an exercise to see, okay, what are the gender gaps by scientific disciplines? And you can see also that, of course, there are a lot of gender gaps in the development of technology when you think about science and technology, but then you start seeing that there are a lot of publications that are going up applying AI to health sciences, applying AI to the physics. In Chile, a very important area of research is astronomy. There are fewer gender gaps in astronomy, and astronomers, well, they're data scientists and they're using different types of algorithms to track the movement of the stars and to conduct research. And more recently, you have we can see that AI has been penetrating the social sciences and the arts and the humanities. So I guess that the invitation would be, looking forward to try to narrow down those gender gaps based on different scientific fields, thinking that not only there's a challenge in developing the technology, but that maybe also gender gaps in the utilization of that technology in the academic sector. And that's something that's fairly easy to do. Those are the things that came out of applying the RAM. Unfortunately, and this is kind of the bad, when we were conducting the RAM, and we were the first RAM, so I know that a lot has changed since then. Universities and professional faculties were not required to publish diversity statistics. Now, that has changed, and there are specific programs in government to try to deliver and create those statistics. But because, going back to my first statement, once you have once you know what the gender gap is, you might take certain actions to try to narrow that down.
I mean, I wasn't expecting for this, but that was fantastic. Just to go to the next, actually, item for discussion, that is, so, oh no, yeah, go for it, because he deserves this applause. Yeah. So actually, very often the question, now you've heard from them the what. What is the size of the problem? What is the assessment of the situation? So let's say this is what comes out of the snapshot. But perhaps then even more importantly is, okay, what do we do about that? How do we move from identifying the size of the issue, the size of the problem, and fixing it? And perhaps trying to fix it as soon as we can, because there are serious consequences for the whole of society. So, and we were actually having an internal meeting with the group of the great group of the Women for Ethical AI just before the conference started. And I was trying to put the attention on one thing, and this: the concept of gender mainstreaming is a fantastic thing. That is, whatever we do, we need to have a look at what is the gender aspect, whether and to what extent the gender variable kicks into this equation, so to speak. However, the risk at times is that we talk about gender mainstreaming, and it's like gender being everywhere, but actually then ends up being nowhere. And this is why in the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, UNESCO was so careful not only to inform each and every area of activity with the criteria on non-discrimination, inclusiveness, the gender inclusion, but then have a specific policy area dedicated to gender that is like, in addition to, every time thinking about this perspective, now let's deal with it also, and let's outline that this is really a key issue we need to deal with, together, for instance, with sustainability and environment flourishing. So let me go back to my panelists with this question. How do we move from there? How can we actually mainstream a gender lens into the realms and do it in a way that is effective and hands-on? Back to you, Carolina.
Okay. Thank you. So the RAM, I think that one of the key issues is, as was mentioned before, we collect a lot of data concerning gender in the social-cultural dimension. But because gender is so cross-cutting, I think the RAM could evolve if we could address a more cross-cutting perspective of gender in more categories. And this also forces kind of policymakers, particularly if you manage to engage with them. Even Elena, which I know she had trouble like engaging with the executive, but she could work with parliamentarians. So once you use an instrument and you ask the questions and they, well, I don't know, I don't have it. I mean, then it's not just, oh, it's the gender and I'm going to tick the gender box, you know. So thinking about making it more cross-cutting across the instrument is key. Another variable, I would say, in the gender dimension, which Julio mentioned it in his comments, and it also ties in with Saida's comment about her classroom composition, is we all know that AI systems and AI companies develop these technologies that then they mainstream and generate these stereotypes. And in my fieldwork with the RAM, I participated in 7 consultation processes with key stakeholders. And in one of them, there were 10 SMEs from the country, and only one was led by a woman out of 10. And Uruguay is a very entrepreneurial in terms of ICT, software, and AI. And so there was just this one woman, and she came with another colleague, and it was a woman. The others were all men, and if they came with another colleague, it would be a man. So this is, again, kind of the 90% of women who actually get into the entrepreneurial business ecosystem. And this is what we want to sort of to address. Okay, so maybe we study, I mean, the girls and the women, they are at universities, maybe they get their university degrees or a technical degree, but then what are these glass roof barriers that we need to sort of address, and the RAM could also contemplate then looking, for example, at if you have ICT chamber associations in the countries. I know that, for example, there are over 300 ICT businesses associated in this e-commerce ICT association. So for the following RAMs, I mean, researchers could sort of maybe look at the composition of that, and that will really render more visible how women are actually shaping a national AI governance landscape. So those are my key comments. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. More idea, please. Elena.
Well, a little more on the data issue, that we need to produce more gender data, gender statistics. And not only to produce them, but to share them, to make them available so that data is used for better decision making, and that it is socialized and used in private and public policies. And also that that data is never neutral, no? And so we have to bring gender perspective into data. And it's not only, it's very important to have it disaggregated by sex and gender, but it's not only that. No, to have women participating in all the data cycle, to ask always how phenomena affect women specifically, and it has to do with what to measure, how to measure, where to source the information, etc. And also that it is so important, these inequalities are systemic. So we have to look at these solutions in a systemic way. When we think about training data, you know, that is crucial for biases that come into AI. We have to look also at women participating in the development of systems, in the training, in the data analysis, but also on financing, on conceptualizing the systems, on evaluating, and in the cultural and social aspects. It's important to have, for example, systems trained in different languages, because it comes with the culture, with the way of looking at the world, but also it comes with gender stereotypes and biases. So we have to look at this very systematically, because we have to be representative of different cultures, but also being aware that it will also come with cultural biases. So we have to look at this systematically. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Sometimes I'm really surprised by the fact that there is plenty of literature out there saying that diversity leads to more creative outcomes in terms of innovation. I mean, if you go into the innovation literature, you find plenty of this evidence. And then sometimes it feels like AI, for instance, it seems like nobody has noticed this huge literature. And the question is, why do they think it shouldn't apply also to this technology that is actually very creative and requires a lot of creativity in the making? Saïda, over to you.
Merci. Donc,
Thank you. After listening to my colleagues, I think indeed we can say that girls work quite hard in STEM careers and they try to make progress. But of course, there's this glass ceiling once you reach the professional world that is there. And of course, we have to go farther in order to make sure that girls have access to every step in the cycle, from the design to the use of this technology. This gender approach, we have to truly mainstream it in the entire cycle of artificial intelligence. Now, what are the aspects that we should be more careful of? So we have to deconstruct our gender roles, and in order to do that,
in order to deconstruct and debunk these biases, we have to be aware of the fact that there is one main challenge. This challenge, I've noticed that it existed when I was rolling out the RAM methodologies. There is a form of resistance against this debunking of biases. It's something that is perceived as a dynamic that is perhaps imported. This is the case in my country, at least, that could be imposed by other organizations. But in fact, there are local components of this approach. And I was saying this before, that participate in this sort of soft revolution that are part and parcel of the culture, of the local culture. When something comes from an international organization, this is where you might feel that it's imposed by someone else, and this is where there's a form of resistance against it. So I believe that as we are rolling out these RAM methodologies, we have to work on what we mean by gender and how this concept is applied to local contexts. We also can here have a link with the main challenge, which is how we can integrate this in our cultures. How can we raise awareness among people, but also how can we adapt this concept? So we have 2 recommendations on gender. On the 17 recommendations that we have, the 3rd and the 7th, what we wanted to ensure is that when we talk about gender equality, that's included specifically, and the 7th recommendation is more specifically about data and how we can have contextualized, local, and timely data. These 2 recommendations, within the discussions that we've had, these recommendations were subject to lengthy discussions with our key partners. So I think the main challenges are really there. There's this work that we have to do about making sure that the gender concept really finds its place in the local context. Of course, this is a reality locally. There is a lot that is being done. So that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, doing all of this work to adapt all of this to local culture and partner that with awareness raising. Thank you, Saida.
Four also is how to change the mentalities through also a multi-stakeholder discussion, because it's true that depending on whom we're talking about, the problem takes different type of features, and also the depth of it changes, whether we talk to, for instance, NGOs, or rather to the companies or to academia. Because, and I remember vividly, we were working at a report for, actually it was the Argentinian presidency of the G20, and it was about gender inclusiveness. And I will never forget the discussion, because very often in many of the advice that is given is like, endow women with the skills for the AI era. Well, typically it's more endow women with ICT-related skills, which for my personal taste falls short of saying all the analysis shows that in AI especially, you need a set of diversified competencies in the very same person. So you need the very technical skills, all the evidence goes in that direction, coupled with social-emotional skills, the ability to work in teams, the ability to collaborate, the ability also to communicate about what we do. But then in recommendations, by the time the gender issue is discussed, especially with some of the stakeholders, you find that they say, oh, endow girls with the skills needed. Like, you know, the problem is them. The problem is that they don't meet the requirements, and that's why they are not in this world. Well, if anything, all the statistics that we have here at UNESCO, but if you look at any statistics that are produced around the world about educational outcomes, we see that girls are nowhere behind men. And I mean, here is not the competition between men and women, but it's just about the actual educational outcomes. So if anything, women are very well endowed with the skills needed for this era. Too bad we are not given the occasion very often to put them to work or to be leveraged. So I think that's also a very important thing that you were saying in terms of Let's change the conversation, let's change the mentality from all the different stakeholders that need to be around the table for this to change. Because of course UNESCO has the main counterpart, the government. But we also understand that, for instance, technologies like AI are mainly developed by companies. And hence, the creation in the context of the implementation of the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence of the Business Council. Our DG, Audrey Azoulay, actually launched it in the course of the last forum on the ethics of AI in Slovenia. And the importance there is to engage those that really produce it, that are, at the forefront of the technology, and do it ethically, again, upholding human rights, human dignities, and fundamental freedom. Over to you, Julio Alberto, for your suggestion about how to best do this.
So I would like to bring the discussion to institutions. And I would like to, I'm also an academic in the School of Engineering in the fields of innovation and entrepreneurship. So I would like to talk a little bit about my research. And as academics do, they like to speak about their research, but this is important for the point that I would like to make. So I've been researching about gender gaps in entrepreneurship. And one area that has one quasi-natural experiment that occurred during the pandemic is that, well, when you start seeing what happens when you have these economic shocks, is that you usually see an increase in entrepreneurial activity in the countries. Well, so there's people lose their jobs, and there are fewer opportunities costs to start a business, so you can see an increase in the number of new business creations. And that's what we saw in Chile. So the pandemic started, and you can see an increase in the number of jobs. So then you ask, okay, who's losing those jobs? The service sector. Who works in the service sector? Predominantly women. So I said, okay, great. So if I start untangling the statistics, I should see an increase of female-based entrepreneurial activity. But that was not the case. So when the start of the pandemic, there was an increase in the number of new business creation in the country, but also an increase in the gender gaps. And the gender gaps only started to close when schools started to reopen. So I gathered really nice data, so I could cross by a municipality level, household level, whether that household had children, the age of the children, and whether their schools that those children attended were opened or closed. And I could see that, thinking about formal institutions, that the school system, it's a formal institution that affects the entrepreneurial activities of families. 30% reduction in entrepreneurial activity could be attributed to closing schools. Now, that's a formal institution. When you start thinking about informal institution, is that when you start looking about the effects of school closures on women versus men, you can see that it's wider. And if the age of the children, it's between 3 and 6, it leads up to almost a 50% reduction. And if you're from the poorest 40% of the population, that gap increases and you're almost 60% less likely to start a business just because of thinking about the schools. So that's a formal barrier, the school system, and an informal barrier, the culture, that it's an uneven distribution between the childcare activities, especially in Chile and perhaps other countries around the world. Now, the second study that I'm doing is that in Chile, again, during the pandemic, there was an increase of 27% in the number of new patent applications, and there was a reduction in the gender gaps in patenting. So, okay, so what might explain this interesting phenomenon? And there's a lot of literature when you start looking about innovation that you have gender gaps in scientific production, but the gender gaps in patenting and innovation are even worse. So females are less likely to be in the name of a patent, even though they might be entitled to do, than on an academic paper. And if you look at the literature, you can see that hierarchical organizational structures negatively affect the probability of a female participating in a patent. And what happened during the pandemic? We had mandatory work from home schemes. So, I mean, that's also kind of interesting because you can see that, hey, if you give more work flexibility, then you might be stimulating more innovation by reducing those hierarchies that are present in the work environment hierarchical organizations such as universities, or the larger the size of the firm, the wider the effect. So those are two ongoing research streams that we have been conducting, but it points, and I guess looking about future exercises about the RAM, about the importance of institutions to diminish gender gaps in entrepreneurship and innovation.
Thank you. So indeed, when we say inclusiveness, that can mean a lot of things. And sometimes the solutions are not the obvious and very next to the problem solution. They can be about support, for instance, endowment. They can be about options, flexibility, and flexibility that does not impinge upon the career progression, because too often, unfortunately, that flexibility we're talking about, unless mandatory, becomes actually a weapon against the career progression of women, because, oh, well, you know, you stayed at home, anyway, you're not in the circle already. Let's say in the tech world, unfortunately, there is a big constituency, which is mainly men, and men from certain parts of the world, and therefore for women becomes even more difficult to actually deal with it. Now, we have the astonishing record of being perfectly on time. Now, I would like to take, and this is again against all stereotypes, because you have an Italian chairs and many people from the south, so you would expect us to be late, but we are not. So, actually, I would like to ask really one last sentence from our speakers about where would you start from? That is, there is a lot to be done. I mean, we heard it. We can look at it from very many perspectives. We can look at it starting from different points, also because each and every country has its own specificities, and therefore you might want to start with the low-hanging fruit, or you might want to start on something that is extremely structural, extremely important. It will take some time, but that's where you want to go. So let me start, I don't know, who wants to answer first? Because this is really like on the very premises question. I don't know. You want to go first, Elena? Just really a very short sentence about this.
Very short, bring women to the table. There are women, very interesting profiles everywhere. Just open the space and bring them to the table.
Thanks a lot. Saïda, s'il vous plaît.
I would like to talk about multiculturalism once more. I think we should listen to local voices. I think that there are local voices that can transform the reality that they know best. So I think we should bring women to the table, but we should also be careful about the fact that they could be different, and difference can be interesting. Thank you very much, Saïda.
So, in the name of diversity, which is what many of the policymakers around AI these days are concerned, I would emphasize the discrimination. I mean, the positive discrimination in terms of data, in terms of their rapprochement for women. So, women in data, women for data around AI, and women at the table.
So coming from Chile, we're a small country. We're not developing necessarily the technologies that are shaping the world. So I would like to bring the attention on the usage of those technology by different economic sectors and scientific disciplines to try to narrow down where the gender gaps might be increasing or reducing due to the use of these technologies.
Muchas gracias, Julio Alberto, for bringing back the issue on the actually inclusiveness. That's what we started from. This has been the leitmotif of this conversation, and we do look forward to having you all engaged in this conversation and pushing those that have the power to decide, the power to act in this quest, because it benefits all of us. Join me in thanking the brilliant panelists today, and over to the next phase.
Yes, we'll just take a picture. And after the picture, we'll proceed with an exciting moment of the day. the launch of the Women for Ethical AI Gender Outlook Study. So I welcome the presenters, Caitlin Corrigan and Eleanor Lam, to join me on stage with all the panelists. Thank you.